In January of 1969, on a rooftop in Marrakesh, the photographer Patrick Lichfield raised his camera. The woman in his viewfinder was 28 years old, wearing a layered kaftan from a souk in the Medina, standing in the desert light beside her husband, the son of the richest man in the world. The photograph took less than a minute. It would appear in American Vogue a year later, captioned in 11 words that did no justice to the revolution it contained. Yves Saint Laurent had visited the same rooftop 2 years before that morning and said, of what he had witnessed there, that his vision completely changed. She would be dead within 2.5 years. She was 30. This is the story of Talitha Getty, born in Java to Dutch artists, survivor of a Japanese internment camp before she was 4, orphaned at 8, pursued by Nureyev, married into the Getty oil dynasty, muse of Saint Laurent, and dead of an overdose in Rome before her 31st birthday. Talitha Dina Pol was born on October 18, 1940, in Mojokerto, East Java, a small industrial city on the banks of the Brantas River in what was then the Dutch East Indies. The stories behind figures like Talitha Getty, the dynasties they married into, and the private wreckage their lives concealed, receive extended treatment in our free Substack newsletter, where the personal and institutional catastrophes, too complex for documentary format, reveal what these extraordinary lives actually cost the people who lived them. The Getty saga belongs in that company. Her parents were Dutch artists. Her father, Willem Jilts Pol, was a painter of some reputation, born in 1905. Her mother, Arnoldine Adine Mees, called Adine, was 32 and frail, born in 1908 to a family of intellectual ambition. The world they inhabited was a strange social formation. A small Dutch elite governing tens of millions of Indonesians across an archipelago of more than 17,000 islands. The colonial families lived in tropical bungalows with white-coated servants, painting and embroidering, in gardens full of frangipani. Their husbands managed the rubber, sugar and oil enterprises that made the Netherlands among the wealthiest colonial powers in Europe. Into this gilded, precarious world, Talitha arrived. She was formed from her first breath by the collision of European culture and the sensory abundance of Java. The drenching heat, the volcanic light, the riot of spice and colour, the layered textile traditions of an island where pattern and dye and embroidery had been treated as serious matters for centuries. That she would later be celebrated above all for her command of colour and ornament, for the way she layered batik against silk against beaten silver, makes sense only when you understand that Java was her first visual language. She learned to see before she could speak. Her father painted mostly Javanese scenes and figure studies that drew on the world around him. Her mother, when health allowed, drew and embroidered. The things she saw were not the muted greens of a Dutch coastal town, but the saffron and indigo of an island whose aesthetic vocabulary would shape every interior she ever decorated and every garment she ever wore. Mojokerto in 1940 was a small place at the edge of the great Javanese sugar and rubber economy, surrounded by plantations and volcanic peaks, a city of perhaps 50,000 people, in which the white population numbered in the hundreds. The Pol family lived in the White Quarter, attended by Indonesian servants whose names appear in no record, in a house of wide verandas and slow ceiling fans, and the particular silence that tropical afternoons impose on European households. Willem painted. Adine, already showing signs of the lung weakness that would kill her, rested in the heat and tried to keep her health together. Talitha, an infant in the first months of her life, was tended by Amma nursemaids whose lullabies were the first music she heard. The colonial world that surrounded the cradle had perhaps 15 months of existence left. The Japanese Imperial Army was preparing, 3,000 miles to the north, to take the rubber and the oil and the islands that supplied them, and the Dutch tennis clubs and plantation houses and painted verandas would dissolve faster than the parents now arranging cribs in Mojokerto could have imagined. The Pol household had never seen a winter, and could not have anticipated one in the political sense either. Talitha was 14 months old when the war reached Java. On March 8, 1942, the Dutch colonial government surrendered the Netherlands' East Indies to Imperial Japan, ending 3 centuries of Dutch rule in a single afternoon. The Japanese military moved with systematic thoroughness against the European population. Dutch civilian men were separated from their families within weeks, herded into prisoner-of-war camps where many would die. In the months that followed, Dutch women and children were rounded up as well and placed in separate civilian internment camps scattered across the islands. On Java alone, approximately 29,000 Western civilians, the majority of them Dutch, a significant proportion of them children, were imprisoned in around 80 camps. The conditions were catastrophic by any account. Initially managed by Japanese civilian staff, the camps became progressively more brutal when the Imperial Japanese Army assumed direct control in 1944. Food rations were cut to near starvation levels, sewerage systems broke down. Disease became endemic. Dysentery, malaria, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis swept through overcrowded barracks where mothers and children slept on bamboo mats inches apart. Inmates who failed to bow deeply enough in the presence of guards were beaten. Roll calls could last for hours in the baking Javanese sun. Around 1 in 8 civilian detainees in the East Indies camps died of ill-treatment, starvation or disease, an estimated toll of between 37,000 and 42,000 among the Dutch civilian and military population. Talitha, separated from her father and interned alongside her mother Adine, lived in these conditions from approximately the age of 1 to the age of 4. She was too young to form conscious memories of the camp. The body keeps its own records, and the woman who would later be photographed on a sunlit rooftop in Marrakesh had passed her infancy on a bamboo mat in a malaria ward. Her mother was not so fortunate. During the internment, Adine contracted a severe pulmonary infection, almost certainly the tuberculosis that was epidemic in the camps, and she never fully recovered. The seeds of her early death were planted on Java in a Japanese compound where the bowing rules were enforced with rifle butts. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The surviving internees emerged from the camps starved, ill, their possessions gone, their pre-war world dissolved. For the Pol family, liberation brought a different kind of ordeal. Indonesia's nationalist movement, galvanized by the Japanese dismantling of Dutch authority, launched its independence revolution within weeks. The Dutch colonial world would never be reconstituted, and the Poles, like tens of thousands of other Europeans, had nowhere to go but back across the ocean. Willem and Adine separated in the chaos of the post-war period. Talitha and her mother relocated to Europe, first to England, then to The Hague. The years that followed were shadowed by Adine's failing lungs. In 1948, when Talitha was 8 years old, her mother died in The Hague at the age of 40, consumed by the disease she had contracted in a Javanese internment camp 6 years earlier. The funeral in The Hague was attended by a small group of Dutch friends and relatives who had survived the war. The child who watched her mother's coffin lowered into Dutch soil had no clear understanding of what had happened to her in Java, only that the woman who had carried her through the camp was now gone, and that the languages of her infancy, batik colours and Amma lullabies, were dissolving into the grey air of post-war Holland. The child who had survived a prisoner-of-war camp was motherless on a continent her mother had brought her to and could not deliver her through. The orphan Talitha went to live with her father, who had settled in London. Willem had remarried, and his new wife was Elizabeth Ann Pol, called Poppet, born in 1912, the elder daughter of Augustus John. The Augustus John connection placed Talitha, at the age of 8, in the most extraordinary artistic household in mid-century England. Augustus John amounted to far more than a successful British painter. He was a cultural institution. Born in Tenby, Wales in 1878, he had studied at the Slade School of Fine Art in London from 1894, earning a reputation by the age of 20 as among the most brilliant draftsmen in England. His portraits of Dylan Thomas, Jacob Epstein and Lady Ottoline Morell hung in Britain's major national collections. He was elected to the Royal Academy in 1928 and awarded the Order of Merit in 1942. His lifestyle, as much as his art, had made him famous, a charismatic, openly unconventional figure who cultivated a wild gypsy persona, wore flamboyant clothes, maintained multiple households with his wife and his mistress simultaneously, and took his extended brood travelling in Romani caravans through Wales, Ireland and Dorset. The Chelsea Palace Theatre had run a comedy number about him in 1917, with the chorus, "When Battersea parking, you'll hear folks remarking, 'There goes an Augustus John.'" His bohemianism was so influential that it directly inspired fictional characters in novels by Aldous Huxley and D.H. Lawrence. The woman who had made Augustus John's household function, his mistress and model and de facto second wife, was Dorothy MacNeil, called Dorelia, born in 1881. Dorelia became in her own time an exemplar of bohemian fashion. She appeared in Augustus's paintings wearing long handmade dresses and scarves, an Edwardian aesthetic that prefigured 20th century ethnic fashion by decades. Even Augustus's wife, Ida, had fallen under Dorelia's spell, writing to implore her to come and live with them in rural Essex. Dorelia's influence ran through Poppet, and through Poppet into Talitha. The sensibility shared by all three women, a preference for ethnic, handmade, romantically unconventional dress, an ease with colour and fabric and ornament, an instinctive rejection of fashionable convention in favour of personal expression, was the same sensibility expressed across 3 generations. When Talitha Getty stood on a Marrakesh rooftop in a layered kaftan in 1969, she was standing in a line of women that ran directly back to Dorelia MacNeil, standing in her long skirts in Augustus John's Chelsea garden 60 years before. The household also gave Talitha a tenuous but fascinating connection to the creator of James Bond. Augustus John had fathered a daughter, Amaryllis Fleming, by Evelyn Fleming, the widowed mother of Ian Fleming. Amaryllis was Ian Fleming's half-sister, a fact that several Bond biographers have confirmed. Since Poppet was Augustus John's daughter, Amaryllis was Poppet's half-sister, and through that connection, Amaryllis was Talitha's step-aunt. The orphaned girl from The Hague had landed inside a family web that included the most famous bohemian painter in Britain and a half-blood relative of the Bond author. Chelsea in the late 1940s was the centre of the British art world. It was a neighbourhood of painters' studios and theatrical lodgings and bohemian drawing rooms that had been the capital of unconventional London life since the days of Oscar Wilde. Talitha, growing up as the stepdaughter of Augustus John's daughter, received an education in beauty and expression that no curriculum could have provided. She decided, at some point in her late teens, that she would become an actress. Talitha enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art on Gower Street in Bloomsbury. Radar was and remains Britain's most prestigious drama school, a place that combined rigorous technical training in fencing, ballet, mime, elocution and makeup with the atmosphere of a creative hothouse. The training demanded a minimum of 36 contact hours each week. The ambition of RADA's students in the early 1960s formed against the backdrop of the kitchen sink revolution in British theatre and cinema, the explosion of gritty working-class realism associated with John Osborne, Alan Sillitoe and the directors who were reinventing the British screen. Writer and journalist Jonathan Meads, who arrived at RADA several years after Talitha had attended, recalled an encounter that captures her physical impact. He first saw her in 1964 with her stepmother Poppet at Seal House in Holland Park. She was, he later wrote, the most beautiful young woman I had ever seen. He gaped, unable to dissemble his amazement. Her appearance arrested observers of considerable sophistication. She had the high cheekbones and warm complexion of someone formed between continents, the quiet composure of a woman who had survived great loss, and an exotic worldly quality that set her apart from the conventionally pretty actresses who populated London auditions. She illuminated rooms rather than entering them. Her film career produced a creditable run of screen appearances across the early 1960s, even if she never achieved star-level success. She appeared in Village of Daughters in 1962, a British comedy directed by George Pollock for MGM, about a travelling salesman who discovers an Italian village full of marriage-seeking women. The Comedy Man followed in 1964. That same year she took a part in We Shall See, an Edgar Wallace mystery. Michael Winner cast her in The System, also known as The Girl Getters, a kitchen sink drama starring Oliver Reed and David Hemmings. Her most significant role came in Return from the Ashes in 1965, directed by J. Lee Thompson for United Artists. The film was a dark psychological thriller set in Paris in the aftermath of the Holocaust, starring Maximilian Schell, Ingrid Thulin, Samantha Egger and Herbert Lom. Talitha played Claudine, a young woman entangled in the central intrigue of deception and murder. The story revolves around a woman returning from Auschwitz to discover that her husband has married her own daughter and is plotting to kill them both for the inheritance. One reviewer described her at the time as the exquisite Talitha Pol, then 25. The notice suggests she was considered a presence even in this company of established European stars. The film placed Talitha in a generational moment. Reed and Hemmings were on the verge of becoming icons of the British New Wave, and Talitha was sharing scenes with the men who would, within months, define a certain kind of dangerous English masculinity for the rest of the decade. Her final screen appearance was an uncredited cameo in Roger Vadim's Barbarella in 1968, the science fiction fantasy starring Jane Fonda. Talitha appeared as a pipe-smoking girl, a brief wordless appearance that carries a note of dark irony given her own life at the time. She had, by 1968, left acting behind almost entirely. The social world she had married into had become its own consuming performance, and the script she was now living was being written in a Moroccan palace rather than a London soundstage. Before any of that, before the wedding and the palace and the rooftop photograph, a different man had pursued her. A dinner party in Chelsea was about to deliver her to the wrong one. Rudolf Nureyev had defected from the Soviet Union at Le Bourget Airport in Paris on June 16, 1961. The defection was almost theatrical, an impromptu leap to freedom in the face of KGB supervision that made the Soviet ballet dancer simultaneously the world's greatest performing artist and one of its most romantic fugitives. He had been touring with the Kirov Ballet when the Soviet handlers attempted to send him home early, and he had bolted past them at the airport gate, asking French police for asylum. By the mid-1960s, Nureyev had transformed London's cultural life through his partnership with Margot Fonteyn at the Royal Ballet. He lived between several addresses in Kensington, a magnetic presence at the private views and dinner parties that constituted the social architecture of swinging London. He was primarily attracted to men. His great love was the Danish dancer Erik Bruhn. He was also known to find certain women of exceptional beauty and intelligence irresistible in a way that transcended ordinary categories, and his biographer Julie Kavanagh has documented his unusual interest in Talitha Pol. The two of them met at a party in 1965. The chemistry, according to Kavanagh's biography, was extraordinary. Nureyev told several friends afterward that he had never felt so erotically stirred by a woman. He expressed his wish to marry Talitha Pol. For Talitha, 25 years old, Raider-trained, Dutch by birth and Bohemian by formation, the prospect must have been exhilarating. The world's most famous dancer wanted to marry her. Fate redirected the story with almost literary precision. A dinner party was arranged at the Chelsea home of Claus von Bülow, who at the time worked as a personal assistant to the oil magnate J. Paul Getty. Von Bülow placed Nureyev and Talitha next to each other at table, a matchmaking gesture whose outcome would have written a different ending to the decade. Nureyev was unable to attend. In his absence, von Bülow offered the empty seat to a replacement guest. The replacement was John Paul Getty Junior, the artistic, restless, fabulously wealthy son of the richest man in the world. It was at this Chelsea dinner, at the seat Nureyev had vacated, that Talitha Pol met the man she would marry. The counterfactual is irresistible. Had Nureyev kept his dinner engagement, one of the great tragic stories of the 1960s might never have been written. Talitha might have spent her years at the side of a dancer, rather than at the centre of a heroin marriage. Klaus von Bülow, the man who had hosted the dinner, would emerge 2 decades later as the defendant in one of the most sensational attempted murder trials of the 20th century, accused of injecting his socialite wife Sunny with insulin to claim her fortune. The trial would consume New York and London tabloids through the 1980s and produce the Jeremy Irons film Reversal of Fortune. Von Bülow would be convicted, appeal successfully with the assistance of Alan Dershowitz, and be acquitted at a second trial. The man who had arranged Talitha's seating, in other words, was on his way to becoming one of the iconic European villains of the late 20th century, even before he placed her at the dinner that would change her life. He was a figure of European malevolence who seemed to materialize at the intersection of wealth, glamour and destruction wherever it appeared in the 20th century, and he had now, with a single seating chart, set Talitha Pol on the road to Marrakesh. John Paul Getty Junior, born in 1932, was the 5th child of J. Paul Getty Sr., the Oklahoma-born oil magnate who had built one of the largest private fortunes in human history. J. Paul Sr. had assembled the empire through a combination of geological intelligence, ruthless deal-making, and extreme personal frugality. He had, at various points in the 1960s, been cited as the richest man in the world. He was famously parsimonious to the point of caricature, a man who installed a payphone in his English country house, Sutton Place, for the use of guests. Paul Jr. was in almost every conceivable way his father's opposite. Sensitive, artistic and temperamentally allergic to the oil business into which he had been born, he had already abandoned his position running Getty Oil Italia in Rome. His father had cut him off as a result. He had been married previously to Abigail Harris, called Gail, with whom he had 4 children: Aileen, Mark, Anne, and the boy who would later become infamous, John Paul Getty III. The marriage had ended in divorce. When he met Talitha at von Bülow's dinner party, Paul Jr. was a beautiful, damaged, fabulously rich man, searching for something he could not name. He found it across a table set for someone else. The couple married on December 10th, 1966, at Rome's Campidoglio, the magnificent civic hall atop the Capitoline Hill designed by Michelangelo. In photographs from the ceremony, they look extraordinary together. Paul wore a dark suit and sunglasses. Talitha wore an abbreviated white dress trimmed with white mink, a fusion of old money splendour and avant-garde 1960s fashion that was entirely her own. She was 26, he was 34. The photographs show 2 people radiating the particular confidence of those who believe themselves to be at the centre of the world, which, in the social terms of swinging London in 1966, they effectively were. The match drew enormous press interest. The son of the world's richest man and the most beautiful Dutch actress in London, married in one of the most beautiful civic buildings in Europe, in the city that epitomised la dolce vita. The couple returned to London as man and wife and immediately became fixtures of the most fashionable scene swinging London could offer. Their circle constituted a who's who of 1960s counterculture elite. Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull were close friends. Faithfull was herself navigating the same treacherous intersection of beauty, rock and roll glamour and drug use that would define Talitha's final years. Michael Rainey, founder of the King's Road boutique Hung on You, which dressed the Beatles, the Stones and Jimi Hendrix, was part of their orbit alongside his wife, Jane Ormsby Gore, daughter of the British ambassador to Washington and a central figure in London's aristocratic counterculture. The print designer Celia Birtwell, who became one of the era's most celebrated fabric designers through her collaboration with her husband Ossie Clark, later recalled Talitha as one of the luminous, beautiful people who frequented her world in those years. The marriage was scarcely a month old when the couple set off on the honeymoon trip that would define everything that followed. There was also, beneath the parties and the fashion photography, a deeper network of connections through the Getty family itself. Klaus von Bülow remained in their circle. Paul Jr.'s decision to abandon the Italian operations of Getty Oil had become permanent. The allowance from Sutton Place was effectively closed. What he and Talitha possessed of the Getty fortune existed at one remove, sufficient for the spectacular life they intended to lead, insufficient to insulate them from the consequences of leading it. They flew to Morocco. During the honeymoon, Paul and Talitha visited Marrakesh, a city that had begun to attract artists, musicians and aristocrats escaping the constraints of European convention. The Gettys fell in love with it instantly. In 1968 they purchased a 19th-century Moorish palace in the Medina, the Palais Zahir, which translates literally as Palace of the Joy of Living. They renamed it the Pleasure Palace. The transformation of the Palais Zahir was one of the great interior design projects of the 20th century, and it was almost entirely Talitha's vision. She worked alongside the American designer Bill Willis, a Tennessee-born, Beaux-Arts-trained decorator who had moved to Marrakech and become the defining interpreter of its aesthetic for Western sensibilities. Together, they created an environment of staggering sensory richness. Talitha sourced hand-woven textiles from the souks of the Medina, Ottoman ceramics, silk embroideries, carved cedarwood furniture, hammered copper lanterns, and mountains of jewelled cushions. Every room layered pattern on pattern, texture on texture, an approach to interior design that felt simultaneously ancient and entirely new. Bill Willis later said of Talitha that she had a natural genius for space and colour that he had never encountered in any client before or since. The parties she hosted there became the stuff of legend. More than half a century later, they continue to be spoken of with a reverence that borders on the mythological. Magicians performed in torchlit courtyards, local musicians played until dawn, dancing boys entertained in the tiled salons. Opium and hashish circulated as freely as the wine. The Rolling Stones were guests. Keith Richards later recalled that Paul and Talitha Getty had the best and finest opium. The Beatles passed through. Every major figure of 1960s rock, art, and European aristocracy who found their way to Marrakech eventually found their way to the terrace of the Pleasure Palace. The palace was both a creative achievement and a centrifuge, and the centrifuge was beginning, even at its zenith, to throw off pieces of the marriage at its centre. Paul, increasingly cut off from the family business, drifted further into hedonism. Talitha, whose Dutch-Indonesian eye made the palace an extension of her own sensibility, found herself constructing the most photographed setting in private Bohemian Europe, while the man she had married drifted into the chemical fog that would eventually swallow them both. For a period of perhaps 2 years, the public version of the Pleasure Palace was identical to the private one. The starlit terraces were as glamorous in private as they appeared in the magazines. The hash circulated in service of pleasure rather than dependency. The musicians and the magicians and the cushions and the caftans formed a single coherent universe in which Talitha Getty was the visible, dazzling, completely original axis. The hash circulated in service of pleasure rather than dependency, for now. Marianne Faithfull, who would later document the world she'd been invited into and refused, captured the atmosphere of the Pleasure Palace, with the precision of someone who had recognised what kind of compound she was being asked to enter. 5 weeks in Morocco with the Gettys, she wrote, produced in her an ingrained agoraphobia, a fear of the invitation that had nothing to do with the geography and everything to do with the chemistry. The man who would change Talitha's life again, in a way she could not yet anticipate, climbed the steps to the terrace in early 1967. Yves Saint Laurent had begun spending significant time in Marrakech with his partner, Pierre Berger. Saint Laurent was already, at 30, the most celebrated French couturier of his generation. His first visit to the Gettys' home in early 1967 was, by his own later account, revelatory. He summarised the experience in 7 words. When I knew Talitha Getty, my vision completely changed. What he encountered at the Pleasure Palace operated as something far larger than a fashion statement, an entire way of seeing. He saw the layering of Eastern and Western aesthetics, the ease with which ethnic craft was worn alongside Parisian couture, the absolute conviction of a woman who dressed entirely by her own aesthetic law. The encounter unlocked something in Saint Laurent that would define the rest of his creative life. His spring/summer 1967 African collection presented in Paris used wooden beads, raffia, straw and golden thread to evoke what he had seen in Marrakesh. It shocked the fashion press with its radical departure from Parisian elegance into artisanal craft. In 1968, he acquired a house in Marrakech. His decades-long relationship with the city's colour and form would all flow from his encounters with Talitha and Pol Getty. "Morocco taught me colour," Saint Laurent later said. The teacher in the private seminar of the Pleasure Palace Terrace had been Talitha. He later evoked the scene with the melancholy of a man who understood, in retrospect, what he had witnessed. He recalled Talitha and Pol Getty lying on a starlit terrace in Marrakech, beautiful and damned, and a whole generation assembled as if for eternity, where the curtain of the past seemed to lift before an extraordinary future. The borrowing of F. Scott Fitzgerald's phrase, beautiful and damned, was precise and deliberate. Saint Laurent understood that what he was seeing contained within it, as all the most intoxicating things do, the seeds of its own destruction. The Musée Yves Saint Laurent Paris formally lists the 1967 meeting with Talitha as a foundational moment in his creative biography, placing her alongside Loulou de la Falaise and Betty Catrou as one of the women who most defined his vision. The transformation of Saint Laurent was the first and most important of many. Marc Jacobs, Dries Van Noten, Tom Ford and Phoebe Philo would all cite her as an ongoing inspiration in the decades that followed. Oscar de la Renta would base a collection on her aesthetic. Dolce & Gabbana's spring 1993 collection would explicitly evoke her jet-set bohemian world. Missoni's flowing layered knits and Roberto Cavalli's animal print maximalism would both bear her imprint. Laura Biagiotti and countless others would look to the Marrakesh rooftop as a mood board season after season. The boho chic revival of the early 2000s, the most commercially successful iteration of her aesthetic in the decade since her death, would be saturated with direct reference to her. Sienna Miller, who became the public face of that revival from 2003 onward, with her combination of denim skirts, cowboy boots, suede jackets and layered ethnic jewellery, was effectively translating the Getty look into the vocabulary of Notting Hill and Glastonbury. Diana Vreeland called her the style icon of the century, and the editorial weight Vreeland carried meant the designation became permanent the moment she uttered it. The verdict has never been seriously contested. The single image that fixed the verdict in fashion's permanent memory had not yet been taken. It would be taken on a January morning in 1969, on a rooftop in the city she had made her own. Talitha Getty did not shop from catalogues or follow trends. She invented them. She drew on her Indonesian roots, her years in North Africa, the bohemian aesthetic she had absorbed growing up as Augustus John's step-granddaughter, and her instinctive sense of the theatrical. The result was a visual vocabulary that fused high couture with ethnic street fashion in a manner no woman of her standing had ever assembled before. Every element of her signatures was deliberate, chosen with the eye of a woman who had been trained since infancy in Java to read pattern as language. She wore flowing silk kaftans in saturated jewel tones, emerald and cobalt and saffron and burgundy, sourced from the Medina and from trips through the Middle East and Central Asia. She layered the kaftans over harem pants or wide-leg palazzo trousers in velvet or chiffon, producing a silhouette that was simultaneously loose and structured. She wore Moroccan djellabas over European couture pieces, making no distinction between a Saint Laurent jacket and a garment she had bought for a few dirhams in a souk. On her head, she placed extravagant wide-brimmed floppy hats, embroidered turbans, or intricately worked Moroccan caps. She was equally likely to leave her feet bare on the terrace of the Pleasure Palace as to wear gladiator sandals or cream boots. Her jewellery philosophy ran to maximalism that was architecturally considered. She stacked multiple strands of beaded necklaces, combining African amber, Yemeni silver, Indian gold, and Moroccan enamel on the same throat. She piled rings on every finger, layered bangles from wrist to elbow, and wore ornate Middle Eastern headdresses sewn with coins. From her travels in North Africa and the Middle East, American Vogue noted in 1970, Talitha had scads of kaftans and Saudi Arabian robes and adored their intricate embroideries. What separated Talitha's style from mere fancy dress or tourism was the conviction with which she wore it. She inhabited an Eastern aesthetic, rather than adopting it from the outside. She fused it with her own formation and wore the whole assembly with the ease of a woman for whom this was simply the natural expression of who she was. She had coined what later generations would call boho chic, hippie deluxe, or most precisely, gypset, gypsy plus jet setter. In January of 1969, on the rooftop of the Pleasure Palace, Patrick Lichfield took the photograph that would fix all of this into a single iconic frame. Lichfield was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth and the most fashionable society photographer in Britain at that moment. He had come to Marrakesh as a guest of the Gettys and climbed to the terrace at a moment when the desert light was doing exactly what desert light does in the early afternoon. Talitha wore a striped Moroccan kaftan layered over wide trousers. Paul stood beside her in a hooded jellaba, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Behind them, the rooftops of the Medina stretched toward the Atlas Mountains in the haze. The shutter clicked. It was published in American Vogue on January 15th, 1970, captioned with 11 words, Paul and Talitha Getty, wearing Moroccan kaftans, on the terrace of their holiday house in Marrakech. The caption did no justice to the revolution it contained. The November 1970 issue of American Vogue, published just months before her death, ran a feature titled Vogue's Own Boutique that included 3 photographs of Talitha modelling the fusion aesthetic she had pioneered. She appeared alongside Richard Avedon images of Jean Shrimpton and Angelica Houston. She discussed her preference for Greek and Middle Eastern pieces, her conviction that accessories should tell a story of travel and discovery rather than brand provenance. It was a complete statement of her aesthetic, published while she was still alive and at the height of her influence. The photographs were almost a valediction, taken just before the slow collapse, already underway in private, began to push through the surface. The Pleasure Palace, for all its beauty, was also a place of escalating destruction. By the late 1960s, both Talitha and Paul Getty had become dependent on heroin. The dependency was not unusual in their social orbit. The 60s rock and roll aristocracy consumed drugs with the same casual entitlement with which they consumed champagne. The consequences for the Getty marriage, however, were severe. Paul Junior had abandoned his role at Getty Oil Italia in Rome to the mounting fury of his father. J. Paul Getty Sr. had dismissed him entirely and cut his allowance. Without professional purpose or structure, Paul Jr. sank deeper into addiction and infidelity. He was conducting an ongoing affair with Victoria Holdsworth, a woman he would eventually marry in 1994, after 20 years of waiting out the wreckage of his second marriage. Marianne Faithfull's memoir painted a vivid portrait of the world the Gettys inhabited. She recalled being invited to spend 5 weeks with them in Morocco and feeling an ingrained agoraphobia about the invitation. She understood the nature of what she was being invited into, and she understood that 5 weeks inside the Pleasure Palace, even by the standards of a woman who had been Jagger's girlfriend, would be 5 weeks too many. In July of 1968, amid the escalating excess, Talitha gave birth to a son. The child was given a name unprecedented in the history of the Getty dynasty, Tara Gabriel Galaxy, Gramophone Getty. The name was a pure product of the era's psychedelic whimsy and its conviction that language itself could be weaponized against the ordinary. Tara for the Celtic sacred hill, Gabriel for the archangel, Galaxy for the cosmos, Gramophone for the age of recorded music, and Getty for the dynasty into which he was born. Among Talitha's entanglements during these years, none was more darkly significant than her affair with Count Jean de Breteuil. De Breteuil had been born in Paris on November 15th, 1949. He was the scion of one of France's most distinguished aristocratic families. His father, a close friend of Charles de Gaulle, had been a wealthy property owner in North Africa, and when he died, 11-year-old Jean inherited both the title and the fortune. It was the worst possible combination: a sensitive, directionless young man with unlimited money, an aristocratic title, family properties in Morocco, and no reason to develop any constructive purpose. By his mid-teens, de Breteuil had found his purpose. He enrolled at UCLA in Los Angeles as a cover for what was essentially a full-time career supplying heroin and hashish to the rock and roll establishment of both continents. He imported heroin via the Moroccan embassy in Paris and the French consulate in Los Angeles. He brought hashish directly from Morocco, where his family connections gave him enormous ease of movement. His principal clients included Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, with whom he spent an extended period at the guitarist's villa on the French Riviera in 1971, supplying Thai heroin, and Jim Morrison of The Doors, whose girlfriend Pamela Courson had been introduced to heroin by de Breteuil himself. Marianne Faithfull, who took up with de Breteuil after separating from Mick Jagger, later wrote that de Breteuil saw himself as dealer to the stars. The dealer to the stars was, by 1971, a figure whose supply chain ran directly through the central events of that summer. On July 3rd, 1971, in a Paris apartment at the Hotel Saint-Nicolas, Jim Morrison's girlfriend, Pamela Courson, called de Breteuil to say that Morrison was not breathing. According to Faithfull's account, de Breteuil had supplied the heroin that killed Morrison. He reportedly helped Courson dispose of any remaining drugs in the apartment before fleeing Paris in a panic. 13 days later, Talitha Getty was dead in Rome. The dealer to the stars was now in Talitha Getty's orbit, and the orbit was decaying fast. By 1969, the marriage was functionally finished. Talitha wished to pursue treatment for her heroin and alcohol addiction and return to England. Paul showed no commitment to sobriety. They agreed to a separation. Paul purchased a house for Talitha and Tara on Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, the most romantically storied address in London, a riverfront terrace that had been home to George Eliot, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Mick Jagger. By early 1970, Talitha had achieved sobriety. She was living actively in London, raising her young son, attending parties, and beginning to reconstitute herself as a woman and an independent presence rather than the luminous adjunct to a Getty. Those who encountered her during this period recalled someone who had not dimmed. She was, if anything, more present and more real than the slightly ethereal beauty of the Marrakesh years. The Italian Vogue feature, the American Vogue boutique spread, the London social life. She was reclaiming her life on her own terms. In the spring of 1971, Talitha formally asked Paul for a divorce after years of living separately. Paul refused. He told her he still loved her, that she should give their marriage one more chance. Her lawyers advised that divorce proceedings would move more smoothly under Italian law if Talitha could demonstrate a sincere attempt at reconciliation with her husband. The provision of Italian family law would, with terrible irony, deliver her directly into the circumstances of her death. On July 9th, 1971, 2 years into her sobriety and 3 years after the birth of Tara, Talitha Getty flew from London to Rome. She arrived at Paul's apartment on the Piazza della Coeli, a small square in the heart of the ancient city. The square sits at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, where Michelangelo's Civic Hall had hosted their wedding 5 years before. The geography of her death, in other words, was inscribed inside the geography of her marriage. They spent the night together. What happened in the hours that followed has never been definitively established. On the evening of July 11th, 1971, Talitha Getty was found dead in the Getty apartment. The New York Times reported the news on July 13th. Police said she had been discovered the previous Tuesday evening. The cause of death had not yet been determined. and her body had been taken to a hospital for autopsy. She was 30 years old. The official death certificate listed cardiac arrest, with high levels of alcohol and barbiturates found in her blood. An autopsy conducted 8 months later found traces of heroin in her system, evidence that was medically ambiguous because heroin metabolites can persist in body tissues for many months. The Italian press was unsparing in its coverage and widely speculated that Pol's continued heroin use had caused Talitha to relapse during her 2 days in the apartment, that she had arrived in Rome clean and left it in a coffin. The Italian Wikipedia article on de Breteuil implicates him directly in providing the lethal dose. None of these theories was ever formally proven or officially accepted. In January of 1973, Italian authorities announced that a formal inquest would be held into the circumstances of her death and requested that Pol submit to an interview. In February of 1973, Paul Getty Junior departed Italy for Britain and never set foot in the country again. The inquest proceeded without him and reached no definitive conclusions. The apartment on the Piazza d'Ara Coeli keeps its secrets. The deaths that surrounded Talitha's final year constitute a cluster of cultural loss unmatched in modern history. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones had drowned in his swimming pool on July 3, 1969. Jimi Hendrix died in London on September 18, 1970. Janis Joplin overdosed in Los Angeles on October 4, 1970. Jim Morrison died in Paris on July 3, 1971, 13 days before Talitha. Each of them was connected directly or tangentially to Jean de Breteuil's supply chain. It was, by every measure, a generation passing all at once, a cohort of brilliant, reckless, extraordinarily talented people who had compressed too much life into too little time. Paul Getty Junior moved to Britain in 1972 and acquired a heavily secured mansion on the Thames Embankment in Chelsea. For much of the following decade he became a near-total recluse, taking solace in heroin and rum. During this period his son, Paul Getty III, was kidnapped by the 'Ndrangheta crime organisation in Rome in July of 1973. The elder Getty Sr. famously refused to pay the ransom for months, an act of fiscal calculation that resulted in the kidnappers cutting off the teenager's right ear and mailing it, with a lock of his hair, to a Roman newspaper. The ransom was eventually paid, but the damage was permanent. Paul III descended into drug and alcohol addiction, suffered a devastating stroke in 1981 that left him a quadriplegic and virtually blind, and died on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. He was Talitha's stepson, the child of Paul's first marriage to Gail Harris. His catastrophic life became another spoke in the wheel of Getty tragedy. By the early 1980s, something genuine had begun to happen to Paul Getty Junior. He had converted to Christianity and began to redirect his vast inherited wealth toward the country he had adopted. He donated £50 million to the National Gallery in London, the largest gift for art acquisitions in the gallery's history since its founding in 1824. A further £50 million went to the British Film Institute. Smaller gifts followed for the restoration of St. Paul's Cathedral, for the Imperial War Museum, and for a new stand at Lord's Cricket Ground. The total exceeded £120 million during his lifetime. In 1986, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for his services to charity and the arts. In 1997 he was granted British citizenship. In 1993, in a gesture whose emotional freight was unmistakable, he named his new luxury yacht Talitha G, the first two syllables of the name he had loved and lost. The vessel continues in service today under the name Talitha, now operated for his stepson, Mark Getty. The name is still on the hull. Paul Getty Junior married Victoria Holdsworth in 1994, the same woman with whom he had been conducting an affair during his marriage to Talitha. He died on April 17, 2003, at his home in London, at the age of 70. Their son, Tara Gabriel Galaxy Gramophone Getty, who had lost his mother at 3, grew into a man of purpose. He became deeply involved in conservation work in southern Africa, settling on the Finda Private Game Reserve in northern KwaZulu-Natal and investing substantially in restoring its 12,700 hectares. He joined Conservation Corporation Africa, later rebranded and Beyond, and helped channel conservation funding into education, healthcare, and rural business development across 6 African countries. In 2015, Tara and his wife Jessica founded the Talitha Getty Foundation, integrating conservation, restoration, education, the arts, and healthcare. One of Tara and Jessica's children has been given the name Talitha, a gesture of private tenderness toward the mother he barely knew. The Lichfield photograph hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. Every season the fashion houses return to the rooftop in Marrakesh. Saint Laurent's borrowing of Fitzgerald's phrase, "beautiful and damned," was the most precise epitaph she would ever receive. She had been born in a Japanese internment camp, orphaned at 8, photographed by Lichfield at 28, and dead in Rome at 30. Some people are simply too vivid to disappear.